So today is going to be our 6th webinar, and we're going to be exploring the question, what is a regenerative economy? And one thing I want to say before we get into the topic today is that every previous learning journey we've done, by the time we get to the 6th week, we kind of need to know where we're going to end because we only have 2 weeks left. And because we use an emergent approach to figure out what the topics are each week, we came to the topic today, what is a regenerative economy? In part because one thing we were seeing from the community calls this week was people feeling into what they could offer and what they would need from each other, and how to better understand what's available to us within the abundance just of us here in this learning journey, let alone in the larger Earth Regenerators community or in our networks writ large. And in the host team call, we had this clarity come about that there was a webinar I gave back in the very first learning journey, which was on regenerative finance, which really gives us a clear and understandable way to start thinking about what are the different kinds of value that we can exchange, so that we just have a shared understanding of what that is, and to be able to explore the question, what kinds of value do we have to exchange? Where, like most people think, if I had money, I could do this, but do you have know-how? Do you have institutions that support you? Do you have social support, or are you on your own? There are actually different kinds of value. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today and connect it to the question, what is a regenerative economy? So that we can see how understanding what a regenerative economy is and seeing how to recognize different kinds of value can actually allow us to do things where we remove money from the equation, or do other things that often we think the blockage is we're missing some valuable thing, like money is a sort of stand-in. Like if I only had the money, I could do this. But actually, we may not have something else that we need, and we need to get clear on what's actually needed or what's actually available. And so we're going to be exploring that a bit today, so that we can go more deeply in next week's webinar into what really is an Earth Regenerator. So we can see what we each are as people seeking to be Earth Regenerators, and start to see each other in a more multifaceted way, so that in the final week of this learning journey, we can come to a place of clarity about what are the different ways we can support each other right now within the Earth Regenerators ecosystem, or within the cohort of people in this learning journey itself. And so we feel like the topic today will help us get closer to that by creating a shared conceptual framework. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to mute everyone so that we don't accidentally have any background noise during the presentation part. And I'll begin the presentation now. And what I'm excited about today is I'm going to be blending a bit of theory and some like live experiments happening in Barichara right now. So we'll get a sense of theoretically what is a regenerative economy, and then we'll look at a living case study of something that's unfolding at the moment here in Colombia. So you can just start to see how this works in practice, and then we'll let that inform the way that we have our discussion afterwards. So what I'm hoping is that this webinar will really open us up to a practical conversation. So with that said, let me go ahead and begin sharing screen and start the presentation. So I want to talk about what is a regenerative economy. And I have this photo here partly because it's beautiful and I wanted a pretty picture, and partly because I think there is a tendency that when we think about words like regeneration, or words like flourishing, or words like well-being, that we tend to focus on the part of life that is going well. Like we notice the plant when the flower is in full bloom, as though the regenerative economy is when things are beautiful. But actually, there's a deeper, darker part of the story that makes the beautiful flower possible. And I want to pose it this way. I want you to look at this pile of acacia magnum leaves gathered between some succulent plants that we've been planting in our food forest. And I want you to ask yourself, is this a cathedral of death? Meaning, is this a place where we've gathered together leaves that are decomposing and breaking down? Those are dead leaves from the living tree. Is this a cathedral of death? Or is it a birthplace of new life? Now, of course, it's a trick question because the answer is yes, it's both. That without the cathedral of death, there could not be a birthplace of new life. That flower that we saw that was flourishing and beautiful only exists because other plants have decomposed and animals' bodies have decayed to make the soil that allowed that plant to grow. And so when we're talking about living in a regenerative economy, we're not just thinking about which parts of the system have well-being, but what are the entire dynamics of a living system that give rise to and sustain the ability to create well-being. And that's why the decomposition of leaves, or the cathedral of death, is exactly where there's a birthplace of new life. They're the same process. And so here's another photo that I took this week. This is some of the invasive grass that we had pulled and laid along the lines of our centropic agroforestry system. And when I picked up one of the clumps of grass and looked underneath, lo and behold, I found fungal spores, mycelial webs. This cathedral of death is a cathedral. It's a place to go and find reverence for life. By looking into the decomposition of the grass, I found a flourishing of life in the shadows and in the moist darkness where normally we wouldn't dare to go. And it was in the moist darkness of death and decay that the forest is growing. And so when we talk about a regenerative economy, we have to understand flourishing and we have to understand death. And this leads to what I think is one of the most powerful and coherent frameworks for introducing the idea of a regenerative economy. And this is the principles, the 8 principles of a regenerative economy, articulated by John Fullerton. And if you want to learn more about this, you can go to the Capital Institute's website, and he's got about an 80-page beautiful white paper on regenerative capitalism, that he calls it, that lays out this framework. And what's beautiful is John Fullerton spent about 15 years studying everything he could from wisdom traditions, complex adaptive systems, and living systems in general. And he created a coherent synthesis and summary of everyone else's ideas. And this 8-principle framework tells us what a regenerative economy is. So let's just start at the top. A regenerative economy is in right relationship. So just like those fungal spores are in right relationship with the dead grass, and the dead grass is in right relationship with the mycelial network, which is in right relationship with the bacteria that are fixing nitrogen in the soil at the roots of the plants, and the roots of the plants are in right relationship with the sun. You see, in right relationship means everything knows its place in the web of life. But that also means that there's no part that is separate from the whole. So you have to view wealth holistically, which leads to the second principle. You can't say wealth is how many tomatoes I got from the tomato plant. Because if you got that tomato plant by pouring a bunch of pesticides on the ground to keep, or to put a fungicide to keep some kind of mold from getting on your tomatoes, then you're actually destroying the soil to grow tomatoes, and you don't have a holistic view of health. See, also living systems and regenerative economies are innovative and adaptive and responsive. So they're continually creative, they're continually changing in response to what's happening in their environments, and they're continually seeking some local optimum for health and well-being. But that means every participant in a regenerative economy is empowered to participate as an active agent. The fungal spores are actively trying to survive and be well. The bacteria are seeking out nutrients and depositing their waste. The plants are gathering that waste and using it to grow leaves. Everyone is empowered to participate in their own way. And as I'm working with centropic agroforestry, we can select compositions of plants so that they're empowered to participate with minimum competition and maximum cooperation. But also a regenerative economy honors place and community. The place where I laid down the grass for those fungal spores to grow is where the community of life, that is the mycelium, the bacteria, and the plants, and also animals, because there are dung beetles and there are worms and all kinds of things in there, that they honor their place and the community as a whole system. And what this leads to is that there's an abundance that arises at the edges. So the edge of the decaying grass is where the fungal spores meet the bacterial webs, and the bacterial webs meet the roots of the plants. It's the edge effect the place where the edges of the ecosystem or the edges of the relationships, they create abundance through their interactions with each other. And that abundance gives rise to a robust kind of circulation. Just like the blood flowing in your body, delivering oxygen to every cell and every tissue of your body, there's a robust circulation. And in an ecosystem, there's also a robust circulation of nutrients and energy. And what this means is that there's continually a dynamic recirculation. So the regenerative economy seeks balance, but never achieves it. It's always in a dynamic flow of adapting and responding in an innovative way while honoring these core principles. So you can see that this way of thinking about a regenerative economy is extremely powerful, because you can look at any living system and ask, are we in right relationship? How are we viewing wealth, and is it holistic? Are we empowering participation of all the parts, and so on? And so with this way of thinking about a regenerative economy, we can start to look at how regenerative economies work in practice. I want to take a subset of regenerative economies to talk about for a little while, which is, I want us to focus on the conversational dynamics of our learning journey. What happens in these webinars and what happens in our community calls. And I want you to feel into how we can experience both how value is created and how value flows across our social groups. So how does value flow from the webinar to community call A? How does value flow from the community calls to the host team call? How does the host team call create value that flows into the next webinar? What I want you to notice here is that our conversational dynamics are a regenerative financial system. Why do I say that? Because a financial system is the tracking of value as it's stored and flowed in any real world economy. That's what finance is. People think it's money. Money is a symbol of value that's held or that's moved within an economy. But money is only one kind of value. What I want to show you is that our conversational dynamics in this learning journey work because we have facilitated the process in a pro-social way, which means the elements of our conversation have specific capacities. We cultivate shared identity and purpose in the way that people gather in this learning journey, the way that we organize the webinar themes, the way we host each community call and the breakouts. This leads to a sharing of benefits and costs. The host team are volunteers. I'm not paid to participate. Everyone's valuing through our contributions. We create agreements about the social norms of our participation, and we monitor those agreements through facilitation and participation in community exchanges. This leads to fair and inclusive decisions about how much time each person speaks, about how we take turns, how we listen to each other. And this allows us to resolve conflicts, such as if a person speaks too often, or if someone wants to talk about a different topic, but the rest of the group wants to talk about something else. Conflicts arise every single moment in our attention and our choices, and we're continually resolving them by having a conversational dynamic that is fluid, adaptive, responsive, and flexible, because we are psychologically flexible as we manage every moment-to-moment conflict that arises. And what this means is our community calls and webinars are a regenerative economy. This learning journey is a regenerative economy because we have these aspects of our social dynamics and they create a value flow that is continually adaptive and responsive, including the topic for the next webinar, adapting and responding to what comes up in our community calls. So when we ask ourselves, how can this learning journey be a regenerative economy? And we say, well, there's value in our conversational dynamics and it's stored and flowed. Okay, so what is value? How does it get created? And how does it move around? So maybe the value is that you've learned something. Maybe the value is human connection. Maybe the value is some kind of healing or some kind of insight. Maybe the value is you get some kind of help or support. But how is it created? It's created by facilitated breakouts. It's created by these presentations that I'm giving right now. It's created by a volunteer host team. It's created by your compassionate listening to your peers. It's created by you sharing your personal stories and struggles, which give insights and knowledge to others. And how does it move around? Through our interactions with each other, primarily as conversations. So you can see that value is created in many forms, and it's moved around and we can feel it and understand it. And that's why we keep coming back. If no value is created or moved around, You guys wouldn't be here on week 6. You would have left by now. And so I want to show you that this is mirrored in every living system. And we can see this by looking at something called trophic flow. Trophic flow is just a technical name for the movement of energy and nutrients through a food web. So if you look at a food chain like grass that produces its own body from photosynthesis, to a primary consumer like a grasshopper that actually eats the grass, to a secondary consumer like a bird that eats the grasshopper, to a tertiary consumer like the snake that might eat the bird, the decomposers that are actually consuming the bodies of all the animals that as they break down, creating nutrients for the producers to grow, that there's this movement of nutrients and energy. And what's amazing is that all of the principles of a regenerative economy can be found in trophic flow. They can be found in a food web. And this is important because every time you want to look for a regenerative economy, look at how energy and nutrients flow in the ecosystem where you live. Go and look in your backyard. Go and look inside your mouth and your gums before you gargle with Listerine or brush your teeth, and you'll see a microbial ecology creating plaque. Any place you see life, you will see a regenerative economy, because the regenerative economy is the trophic flow of a living system. But also at a larger scale, this is something I studied as an atmospheric scientist. Let's look at the entire Earth's energy budget. The Earth's energy budget is a measure of all of the sunlight, just a kind of radiative energy that comes from the sun, that enters the Earth's atmosphere. And what's interesting is 77% of it is absorbed by the atmosphere, and then some of it's reflected by clouds back out into space. Some of it's reflected internally back to other clouds. Some of it gets to the surface and warms the surface. Some of it is emitted as infrared radiation from the land surface. And then you get all of the Earth's weather and the circulation of the world's ocean, and all of these mixing patterns are a giant trophic flow for the entire biosphere of the Earth, which means the Earth is a giant regenerative economy, and humans are already a part of it. We're just blind to it, as we talked about in the webinar about what does Gaia want. If we understand that we're part of a giant regenerative economy that can be measured by the Earth's energy budget, then it tells us something important, which is that the solar energy feeds what's sometimes called the geosphere. If you remember from the Earth system science discussion, that's the atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and cryosphere. That's the air, ice, water, and rock. And the biosphere, which is all of the living organisms. And what you'll see is that the biogeochemical cycles, which is just a fancy word for how carbon moves between the so-called dead part of the Earth, the rocks and magma, and the living part of the Earth, the biosphere. Actually, those are completely inseparable. There is no way to separate them. The chemical composition of the Earth's magma near the Earth's core is changed by the living biosphere of the Earth's surface. And there's actually more biomass in the Earth's crust than in the ocean and on land, and microbial activity. And so we can't separate these. And what this tells us is we live within a giant regenerative economy that is the dynamic Earth. Why am I saying this? Because now we can go conceptual and say, how do we create regenerative economies within human systems? How do we take what we can learn from ecosystems and the dynamic Earth and convert it into concepts we can use for ourselves? What I want to suggest now is that we can think in terms of information. Just like there's information about how much of the sun's energy is reflected back into space and how much is absorbed into the atmosphere. That's information, right? So there's an information ecology. And when we're looking at building a human regenerative economy, we care about the built infrastructure, which is information stored as structure. Right now, I'm using a laptop computer that is sending information to you through the built infrastructure of satellite correspondence with relay systems into antennas for radio transmissions and for cell phone transmissions. And that built infrastructure allows the information from my mouth and my computer to arrive to you. And there are knowledge and skills to build and maintain that infrastructure. And there's a lot of social capital, which is the human capacities to maintain and improve this built infrastructure and to share these knowledge and skills. And then there are financial flows, not of money, Remember, finance is the value, is the storage or movement of any kind of value. So financial flow really means any kind of value created in the human economy is flowing through human activity, through the built infrastructure we create and the knowledge ecology or the information ecology that we're a part of. And that means we can look at the information and ask, how do we structure it? How do we change our relationship to it? How do we become the weave, as we talked about in the second webinar, to change the information ecology itself? And this opens us up to a really powerful framework, which is sometimes called multi-capitalism. It takes the idea that some people think capital is money. By the way, those are people who never studied capitalism or economics. Because if you study economics, they'll tell you that one kind of capital is labor, another kind of capital is infrastructure, and another kind of capital is money. But it turns out they're even more than that. Capital simply means something you have that you can put to use to produce something of value. It's that generic. It's like technology is the application of knowledge to solve a problem. It's so generic, it's almost boring. So the word capital, and by the way, I have lots of problems with capitalism, but if you study your history of economics, capital simply means something you can use to do something valuable. That's all it means. So let's take away the ideology and the hubris and the bullshit of neoliberal and neoclassical economics, because those are mostly idolatrous religions, and look at what it really means. Capital is just the ability to do something of value. So there's natural capital. All that means is the living world, rocks and trees and metals and water and living organisms can be put to use to do things that are helpful. You can eat an egg and get protein in your body. Okay, natural capital is just that acknowledgement. But then there's also political capital. Political capital is the ability to gather people and make decisions to achieve a collective outcome. Notice political capital is not our dysfunctional political systems. It's the human ability to get something done together. So all of us sitting here, we've all quietly agreed that I would speak and you would listen during the time of this presentation because the political capital is aligned with me giving a webinar. See, political capital is the ability to make a collective decision to achieve a collective outcome. Social capital is the ability to do things for each other. Like I have studied Earth system science and maybe you didn't, right? So part of the social capital is you have a relationship with me where I share what I have with you and that helps you. And I feel valued and loved and I feel belonging in the community, so I get something I need. Social capital is the value inherent in our relationships to each other. Knowledge capital is anything we know that could be useful to someone else. Like I know how to make an omelet, right? That's knowledge capital. I know how to take a needle and thread and mend a hole in your pants. I know how to paint your toenails, thanks to Elisa, I actually do. Knowledge capital is the ability to take our knowledge and do something useful. Institutional capital is the ability to create some kind of organizational structure that enables us to do things. And inspirational capital, which is a concept that I took from the Common Land Foundation. By the way, the founder of the Common Land Foundation is visiting Barichara this coming week. I'm really excited about that. And they found inspirational capital is one of the most valuable things out there. Inspirational capital is the activation of our living energy to feel alive, to feel motivated, to feel inspiration, to imagine something different and new. Turns out inspirational capital is one of the most invisible and one of the most powerful forms of value that we have. The reason I'm mapping this out is that all these different kinds of capital exist. Actually, even more than this, there are different frameworks that include more. And if we start to see the different kinds of value that we have among us, we can create a flow of regenerative finance. And notice something, I didn't include financial capital because financial capital is simply the measuring and the tracking of the movement and the flow of all these other forms of capital. So everyone who thinks money is capital is so blindly confused. As one of my old Romanian friends used to say, they've confused the menu for the meal, as if the picture of the cheeseburger is edible instead of the actual cheeseburger. People think money is the economy, but actually the economy is the economy, and money is an inadequate measuring tool. Because it turns out most of the real capital in the world is not measured with money. And this is what's interesting, is that when you start to track where value is and how it moves, and you call that financial capital, you're actually letting the number of your measurement be a surrogate for something that's actually valuable. But it's actually not the thing that's valuable. And that tells us how to use money, doesn't it? If we create a monetary system, it's to track what's actually valuable and to put it to good use to achieve our purposes. And then we have a monetary system that works for us. So I want to give an example of this. I want to talk about a pattern of regeneration that's happening here in Barichara right now, where there's a regenerative exchange occurring that shows how this works in real life, where we decided to solve a problem without money. It looks like this. Here's our example. Say hello to Paco. Paco is the professor of syntropic agroforestry here in Barichara. He's a Colombian man. He spent some time in Brazil learning syntropic agroforestry at the Ghosh Institute. And he's come back here. He was here a few months ago and we did some workshops. Now he's just returned to teach syntropic agroforestry. This is extremely valuable. He has a lot of knowledge to share. This is Angela. Angela can provide housing for Paco. And we have some money to pay for syntropic agroforestry, but really we'd rather give that money to the projects that are doing agroforestry instead of paying Angela. And Angela doesn't need to be paid if she has some other way of tracking value for something that we do. And then enter Antonio. Antonio is a friend of ours. I think he's even here on the call with us. Antonio was just here in Barichara and he had brought a drone. Notice there's like some kind of institutional capital by having a drone, and there's knowledge capital of Antonio knowing how to use it. There's social capital that Antonio is my friend and he offered to fly the drone for Angela. And so he flew the drone to map Angela's land, where she wants to create a food forest to create natural textiles for teaching children in the territory how to make natural textiles for clothing and for natural clothing dyes as part of a cultural conservation project she's doing. But there's a lot of erosion on her land. So we talked about how we might regenerate this erosion on the land in exchange for Paco's housing. Now, what's beautiful in this is we decided that money was a barrier to finding a valuable exchange. So we asked the question, what can we do together if we don't exchange money? Only when we did that did the relationship pattern reveal itself that Angela needs someone to stop the erosion and start doing syntropic agroforestry on this land, that Paco can do some of this, that I can do some of this, that other Earth Regenerators can do some of this. But to really see it, we needed to map it. And Antonio was here with his drone. And through a bit of clever negotiations in the span of 3 days, we created a way for Paco to have housing during the next 6 months, while we create a new demonstration project in the territory to restore a piece of land, to combine erosion control and watershed restoration with syntropic agroforestry, using our knowledge and skills, and we removed money from the equation. So this is a regenerative financial flow in a regenerative exchange where money was removed from the process. And this is possible because we'd already received money as a donation to set up the syntropic agroforestry system. This is a picture from yesterday where Paco was in the nature reserve that Angela manages, and he was leading a pruning workshop to show people how to cycle nutrients from the plants and grow soil. And we agreed that Paco would do these demonstrations on her land as part of the work exchange for his housing. All of the people you see around him were participants of our first workshop, which means we have a lot of knowledge capital being exchanged, a lot of social capital of people sharing their ideas and supporting each other. All of these people did work on Angela's land in order to learn the techniques. Angela provided the infrastructure of the nature reserve where this work is being done. And very powerfully, inspirational capital grows every single time we do this, as people they keep going from one field site to another to learn and share their techniques without anyone paying money. And they're like, how is it we're building a regenerative economy to reforest an entire territory and we're not even exchanging money and we have everything we need, which is a deep process of decolonization. All of this is happening because we asked the question, could we get Paco housing without having to pay for it? And all of this started to emerge. I want to draw attention to something bigger, which is something that this project at MIT showed back in 2016 or 2017. They created a project called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. And what they did is they studied knowledge and infrastructure of different innovation economies. And what they found was this, that if you want to know how innovative an economy is, you don't look at how much money it makes. Instead, you look at the diversity of systemic capacities. Systemic capacities in terms of the ability to create and follow through on outcomes. So notice how we could create an outcome of teaching techniques in syntropic agroforestry because we had the capacity of Paco to teach it. And we had a place to do it, which is another systemic capacity, because Angela had a nature reserve. So the idea is there are systemic capacities. Sometimes this word affordances is used, which is what is the system capable of offering? And so when we ask, what is the diversity of knowledge and skills? And what are the structural relationships for organizing and mobilizing the knowledge and skills? And it turns out it's the combination. Knowledge and skills. What can people in your economy do? And how are they organized to mobilize their labor and knowledge to achieve an outcome is the measure of prosperity. And when you practice seeing the flow of value in ecosystems, you'll see it in human economies too, because human economies are ecosystems. And this is really, really important. So for example, here in Barichara, we have knowledge and skills in local crafts, ancestral knowledge about weaving and basket making and clothing. There's lots of permaculture training. This is my friend Alun learning how to use a pickaxe in the bioparque. And so we have all this knowledge and skills, and the question is, how is it organized? Are we organized to achieve outcomes? And the more we organize our knowledge and skills, the more we grow our knowledge and skills about how to apply our knowledge and skills. And if we know how to apply our knowledge and skills, which is a different kind of knowledge and skills, then we can begin to live as a regenerative economy. And this is a key question for us in this learning journey. Do we know what our knowledge and skills are? Do we know how to organize them? And as we organize them, do we know what we're trying to achieve as outcomes with them? The better we answer these questions, the better we can live as regenerative economies. By the way, this works at the scale of entire landscapes. Common Land Foundation, which I said the founder, Willem Verwerda of Common Land, is a friend of mine. He's coming to Barichara this week. They have been able to identify and measure 4 returns from landscape restoration. And these are at the scale of 100,000 hectares or larger. These are very large projects. Their project on the Altiplano of Spain is more than 1 million hectares. And what they found is you can mitigate risks by defining the landscape as a natural zone, where you basically just create natural ecosystems, a combined zone, which is like agroforestry or regenerative agriculture, and economic zones, which are primarily for human use, so that they don't encroach on the other two. And with these 3 different zones mapped onto a territory, you can measure 4 returns. The return of financial capital, which is you invest money and create a real economy. A return of natural capital, which is simply creating more health and vitality in the ecosystems. A return on social capital, which is trust, infrastructure, and capacity to do things. And a return on inspiration, which is the imagination and the belief and the desire to do more. And as I said, they found in practice, inspiration is the most powerful return of all. And so this is working at large scales. They're working in 13 different countries right now. And so we can think about this at the scale of a breakout room in one of our community calls, or we could think of it as the deserts in the heart of Spain. Or we could think about it as the network of river systems here in the mountains of the Andes, where I am in Colombia. And it works at all scales. We can also think about it for a single piece of land. We can think of land as a bank for regenerative investments. So we might want to retain water and build soils. We might want to train people and provide livelihoods. We might want to provide housing and grow food. We want to cycle nutrients and create material flows like sustainable agroforestry and construction materials or food, whatever it is. And we want to grow the capacities of the local economy, weaving them together with other projects in the landscape. This is what we're doing with the land Las Albercas in our efforts to create an ecoversity. And this is what we're currently doing in the Bioparque Moncora with a food forest and syntropic agroforestry system, is that we are training people We're providing housing for non-human species. We saw a new wasp nest growing in one of the trees just yesterday, providing housing for non-human species in the bioparque. But you can see the land is a bank for regenerative investments by simply understanding what regenerative finance is, because it may not be money. And then this is something really important, is when you ask yourself, how is it that people in Barichara are organizing such complex work? This is a design that I came up with back in March of 2020 to explain an idea I had for creating an Earth Regeneration Fund. And then we started prototyping it as the Barichara Regeneration Fund about 1.5 years ago. And notice the steps. Learn to work as a functioning group. Here in Barichara, we created the advisory council with representatives of 15 local projects, which means we could partner with projects regenerating other land because the members of the group had their own projects in other land. We could acquire plots of land to regenerate. We bought a piece of land called Origen del Agua. We're in the process of negotiating the purchase of another piece of land called Las Albercas. And we're growing already in Barichara to 20 to 30 projects at varying scales. All of them exist. We've been mapping them into the landscape. And we're starting to create measurement tools for regenerative flows. So we're creating things like a learning center and transformation of local food systems. We're creating a network of demonstration sites in Trophic agroforestry. Through the transformation of local food systems, we're creating a community food hub, commercial kitchen, and a network of field sites for biodigesters, for food dehydrators, for processing of plants like fruit to turn them into high quality products. And this allows us to diversify risks and diversify benefits. And we're evolving into a platform cooperative. Our version here in Barichara is a territorial foundation that we're in the process of setting up. And you can see that this conceptual diagram maps onto what we're doing in Barichara. If you want to learn more about that, join our Barichara updates on Thursdays at 11. And we have 7 previous ones that are recorded. You can go back and watch. We're creating this in real time, and this exists right now in Barichara. We want to create this design of portfolios here to show how it works in a real physical example, in a real community, so that people can replicate it in other bioregions. So notice the relationship between pro-social groups, groups that can work together to achieve collective purposes, and networks of regenerative projects. Like we have here in Barichara, we have lots of different regenerative projects. What we're doing is we're creating ecological flows. We do this by actively guiding the interactions among the different kinds of capital. So we recognize all these different kinds of capital, and our pro-social groups work across a network of regenerative projects. That means all of this is built on the foundation of pro-social groups that cooperate with each other. And we get better and better at cooperating as groups of groups to do this at the territorial scale. So you see, the idea of a regenerative economy is so important to understand so that we can grow to this level of clarity and complexity, because we are working with living systems, which are incredibly complex and profoundly beautiful. And so by learning to see that we are nested within them in this way, starts to show us that trying to reduce the complexity is the wrong intuition. Learning to dance with complexity is the right intuition. So for example, Penny took this picture yesterday. That's my daughter Elise. Isn't she adorable? That shovel's a tiny bit big for her. That's me using a local trowel called a mocho. We're digging a water retention pond. What I want you to notice is that Elise and I are a pro-social group of 2 digging a pond. And we have value flow of knowledge and tools and social relationships and shared purpose and inspiration. And it's a daddy-daughter moment that I'm going to cherish for the rest of my life. And what I wanted to show you is that these regenerative economies can be as small as me and Elise digging a hole. And they can be as big as the entire planet. But it's only when we learn how to see through the eyes of multiple forms of value and to see the regenerative flow as we create together in pro-social groups, only when we learn to see the world this way can we measure, track, and improve it, and guide it intentionally and mindfully. And it's as much fun as this picture looks. So that leads to a question that I have for you. What are all the ways you can give into the place where you live? I'm using the word place in a very flexible way. The place might be how can you give to community call A tomorrow? Or it could be, how can you give to your apartment building or a community garden in your neighborhood? See, like, what are all the ways you can give into the place where you live? And how does this shape what you are able to receive? And can you create a robust circulation between the two? Can you start to give into the place where you live in a way that allows you to shape your ability to receive so that you can receive what you need to continue giving in a robust circulation? If you can do this, you are a regenerative economy. It's that simple and that profound. And so let's discuss. I'm really curious what you all think about this one. So I'd love to know how this lands with you, if you have questions, what it makes clear, what it brings up.
Joe, I wanted to add a little bit of color to the end of that story with Angela and Paco.
Please.
As you know, right after we took the drone footage, a huge storm came in and we ended up getting stuck on the mountain in the mud. And Paco and I had to get out in the rain and work with Angela to unstuck the car out of the mud. In the process, me getting covered in mud. So I think we built some social capital there too.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I got to hold Elise as she was shivering in my arms, which created a beautiful bonding experience between us as we were standing in a shelter waiting for the rain to end. And so there were various kinds of unexpected benefits. Like, could you imagine me being stuck in a heavy rain with my 5-year-old led to deeper bonding with my daughter? And so would I have said, take my child into a heavy rainstorm to bond with her? No. But did it happen? Yes. And that's one of the things about regenerative economies being adaptive and responsive and innovative. The innovation was we created a new opportunity for bonding because of the context and the relational space we were in. So Antonio getting to bond by mud being flung all over his body as he's pushing a truck is a nice example of that too. So Antonio, thank you for that. Beautiful, beautiful story. Are there any questions or comments that people would like to share based on this webinar? Just please raise your hand. Brian, please. Nope, whenever you're ready. Or Brian, if we need to wait a minute, should we go to, maybe let's go to Jonathan and Victoria and then we'll come back to you. So Jonathan and Victoria, come on in.
Hi, oh, that was beautiful.
Oh no, we lost you. What happened? Oh, you're back.
Okay. I'm saying, oh my God, I want so many people to listen to this session. So I will remember this forever. Can you give us an example? So thank you. I mean, really, it was such a bringing to a synthesis of everywhere we've been and where we need to go. So I just so appreciate this. Can you give us an example of being a regenerative economy as an individual?
Yes, I can. Penny, would you demonstrate? Take my hand. Penny's right here. I want you to see a regenerative economy is a mutual exchange that creates health and well-being between people. And when two people care about each other and we touch, we create healing and connection, which is fundamental to human well-being. And so it's so simple, it's profound. It's so simple, it's profound, that it's as simple as holding hands with someone you care about. And so yeah, I could give more examples of this.
What I mean is how someone would not need money in this society and do it out of the principles that you just said. What do I wrote it down as, what can I give where I am that shapes the receipt of what I need in order to keep giving, which is what I love.
Well, one of the elements of this is to understand what a commons is. And I know you have some understanding, I'll just summarize it for those who are less familiar. So if you look at, and within pro-social is one place to find this. Eleanor Ostrom in her research identified 8, they call them core design principles. I actually prefer to call them system capacities. There are 8 system capacities for governing a commons. And it's really important to know them because when you know the 8 core design principles or system capacities, you can create a commons. And when you create a commons, you don't need exchanges outside of the commons, which means you can definancialize. You remove the need to pay for something. And I say this because
How is it compared? Like, you know, in the, just how is one thing valued in order to put things together in a creative way?
well, let me tell you how Earth Regenerators came into being. Earth Regenerators came into being because I gave everything away. Now, how could I give everything away? Because I was a commons. How was I a commons? People donated money to me on a monthly basis on Patreon. And once I got up of about $1,000 per month, I could live and raise my family in Colombia. And I didn't need to earn income. I was independently, I like to joke, instead of being independently wealthy, I was independently poor. I found the least expensive way to be independent from money. By getting rid of our car in the US, which is a big cost, moving away from cities in the US to smaller towns, moving away from the US to other places, dematerializing my life, so that gradually I had fewer and fewer financial needs. And then as soon as there were enough people supporting me on Patreon, and the magic number at the time was about $1,000 per month, I could support my entire family to live in Barichara on $1,000 per month, which meant I could give everything away. So it's not an accident that in November of 2019, we moved to Barichara. We came to Barichara to visit. In December of 2019, I started writing the manuscript of the book. And December 30th of 2019, I announced the creation of a study group to read the chapters, and Earth Regenerators was born. And in the next 6 months, I gave something like 30 free webinars. We grew to 2,000 members. Everything was free. It was all a gift economy. And one commons enabled the growing of another commons. And then starting in April of 2020, we gradually began a process of creating decentralized governance, which was a diverse set of new commons. And here we are 2.5 years later. Earth Regenerators is big and diverse and multifaceted and has multiple kinds of commons. And people don't have to pay money. Now, there's some basic things like we needed to raise money to pay the $1,200 a year for the Mighty, or the $1,000 or $1,100 per month per year for the Mighty Network subscription. You know, and the learning journeys, we ask people to donate to them so we can ship them books. So Jeffrey had asked a question about books. I need to get books shipped out, and I have a backlog, and I'm the bottleneck. I tried to find volunteers to ship out books before, but that model only worked when Natalie was doing it. Natalie Von Turnout, who I think is here with us today. After Natalie stopped doing it, she was so amazing. I thought we'd find other volunteers that could keep doing it. We haven't been able to, so I actually need to send them out myself because there's such a backlog. So I apologize, everyone, for that. The commons of volunteer dispersal of the books failed after Natalie went on the road. Natalie, that's not a criticism, that's a celebration of how awesome you are. But you can see that this way of building a gift economy and operating as a regenerative economy is built on commons. And the initial commons was my knowledge together with my financial liberation to enable a digital commons, which is a free subscription to Mighty Networks that anyone could join. And I also had a free subscription to Crowdcast at the time. And through those various commons, we created Earth Regenerators. And then other commons accumulated there and were born there. So you are living in a regenerative economy now by being in Earth Regenerators.
Wow. And then how do you scale this? Do you have a sense of, you've done it, everyone, you know, the questions in my mind came up. How much of this part of me that someone wants can I afford to put when everyone's at? So if I were to become like whatever people need of me that I can do, then it just can't take more than like 12 hours a day. And my day may revolve around how do I right now serve the community, given what I love to do, and as much of that as I want to do, you know, so that I can achieve a level living in this society where I need a mortgage payment or whatever, that I can continue to give myself to the needs there. And then when everyone,
Part of the problem is, Part of the problem is if you're embedded within a debt-based extractive economic slavery system, you're almost guaranteed to be unable to do this. I actually had to decolonize and uncivilize my life, which for me personally meant leaving the United States. I found my path by going to another landscape. But this is actually profound and scary, is that a lot of us are in contexts where we won't be able to, because we won't make the choices or take the risks to leave various kinds of comfort that are built on deeply unsustainable systems. And so that's just a reality sort of sobriety check we have to deal with. Even if that's the case, like let's say you stay where you are and you can't do it where you are. You can still support others to do it. And so there are all kinds of ways to participate in that. You know, that's wide open still with the constraints, but it's just recognizing that ecological limits are what ends up being the kind of ironclad law here. Sort of like you cannot, violate the laws of thermodynamics. Sorry, everyone who's tried has failed. You can't go faster than the speed of light. There are like these physics constraints. Yeah. For regenerative economies, we can't go beyond the limits of what ecosystems can do. And so that's part of this. But it's incredible what happens when we gain the ability to move through something called an evolutionary transition, which I recommend, go into Earth Regenerators and type in the search box, evolutionary transitions, and you'll find in one of the reading materials, way back a year and a half or 2 years ago, I wrote an article about evolutionary transitions. I gave a webinar on them in a previous learning journey, but I'm not sure where it is at the moment. I have to go find it. But if you look at what an evolutionary transition is, you'll see that if you take the idea of an evolutionary transition and connect it to pro-social groups, you'll recognize that becoming a pro-social group is an evolutionary transition. And then the group behaves as a superorganism. And that group has superpowers, meaning a pro-social group can do more than any of us can do on our own. So we actually gain abundance of ability by working together in teams. And this is the secret. So what I showed you with that portfolio of regenerative projects, thank you, Mitty, you're amazing. If you look at that portfolio of regenerative projects in a bioregion and how it has a diversity of capacities in it, if it's pro-social, it's a superorganism, or at least it aspires to be. And you can actually move up to the scale of territories by going through this process of pro-social groups, networks of projects, growing in capacities, portfolio of diversity within those projects, understood as networks, organized as physical territories. That's the bioregional approach. And that's the best way to scale. That's the bioregional regenerative living economies approach. So yeah, we're trying to do it here in Barichara. We're not the only ones, but we're consciously trying to share what we're doing with these frameworks. And now I've spent a lot of time here because Victoria, your questions and discussion is so fruitful. So thank you for that. But I'd love to go back to Brian. Well,
let me just say one thing. People should know that we have this course that's about right livelihood. Mm. And so this is so germane to the conversation Maya and Gail and Jonathan and I had yesterday in preparation for this coming Wednesday at 8:00 Eastern. Mm-hmm. And then there's another one the following week for the other hemisphere at 5:00. But the design is that Gail is going to speak about, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying this, this is the design. Well, Maya will do a presencing for the group so that we draw in the collective consciousness. Gail will say, this is what I'd love to do, and I'm stuck in this, financial economy, this money economy, and I haven't been able to do it. I'm stuck, and I think I know how, but I'd love, or I think I know what, but help me how, break that barrier. And so we're going to go through a process, but we'll do this the kind of thing for people to give them a sense of right livelihood and wherever they're stuck in their quest for right livelihood. So.
Yeah, could one of you grab the link for that and drop it into the chat so anyone who's here could join you if they'd like? I think that'd be beautiful. And now, Brian, thank you for your patience, although I'm sure that was not like twiddling your thumbs. What a beautiful conversation. But I want to just get back to you. So please.
Right, that quite frankly, I mean, that all really wove very well into, because my question is very unstructured. I mean, I think that prior dialogue may provide a bit of a foundation. I find myself working with kind of meta level embedded hierarchies. And your presentation of regenerative finance is so organic. The question of scale is really relevant. What I find myself looking at are basically gaps between even the embedded hierarchies. So if you think of socioeconomics or the classic economic model as an embedded hierarchy, at an overarching level above that, you have, and it's missed by Kate Raworth's model. She basically embeds the hierarchy of polity, which is defined loosely as the level of institutions, structural institutions, societal rules and laws, basically what you refer to kind of as the societal agreements, but that level being an embedded hierarchy under that of both societal and then the next higher level of environmental. So what I'm seeing with respect to complex adaptive systems in relation to governance is kind of it's kind of a catch-22 in that governance is imposed kind of at a higher level on that of the economic structure that we're all kind of and so with respect to values.
I have a framework for this. Well, I don't. Eleanor Ostrom has a framework for this. She called it polycentric governance. And the way it works is this. If you look at those 8 core design principles of governing the commons, let me just name a couple of them. Shared identity and purpose, equitable distribution of benefits and contributions, fair and inclusive decision-making, fast and fair conflict resolution, monitoring of helpful and unhelpful behaviors. But one of the others, there are 8 of them, one of them is autonomy of the group to govern itself. And another one, it's called core design principle number 8, is collaborative relationships with other groups. And so what happens is when you combine, like here's a group that has some purpose and they have autonomy to serve their purpose, and they have a collaborative relation with another group. What you end up with is polycentrism, which is multiple centers of decision-making. And they end up organizing fractally up to the scale of commons that are shared between them. So a good example of this is if you have a river basin that's got several tributaries, you may have some kind of management system for the entire watershed, but then a smaller management system for each tributary, or maybe one specifically for fish, maybe one specifically for agriculture, and they end up overlapping in ways that have multiple centers of decision-making. And if they govern as a commons, this is a big if because most of them don't, the jurisdiction of each group maps to its purpose. So it is autonomous to self-govern. And what we often see is something like state boundaries or metropolitan planning areas or national boundaries that are not defined around commons. And so the jurisdictions don't map on and they break the commoning process. And so what this means is that to create a commons, you build it from the ground up, only because the existing infrastructure is destroying the commons simply because of jurisdictional boundaries, let alone everything else. Like just for that reason, it wouldn't be a commons. And so what we're doing here in Barichara that is an example of this is when we created criteria for the Barichara Regeneration Fund, we created something called biocultural corridors. And it was simply that there are ecological connections on the land, drainages of water, biological corridors for movements of animals, soil types, things that were in the land itself. And then there was a cultural dimension, which is how do humans organize to manage those as elements. And then you're with biocultural corridors of connectivity across the land, and you build them up like fractals until you've covered the entire territory. And then what you have is polycentric governance, because you have a watershed council for each of the tributaries. You might have a representative sent to a larger water council of a watershed, but they're multi-centered. And so this is why Elinor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize in Economics, was by showing how all of this works. So I just wanted to say that the work in polycentric governance is usually seen as a more advanced expression of pro-social, but it's actually pro-social groups will naturally evolve toward polycentric governance, which is where models like sociocracy and holacracy, they sort of prescribe group dynamic patterns to try to do this. And if they're not grounded in the evolutionary process of pro-social, or of Elinor Ostrom's core design principles, they won't get there. And if they are, they have a chance of getting there. And they still may not, because it's hard. But I hope that at least starts to give a context for how to think about this, as there are many centers of governance, and each of them is its own commons. But then there are interchanges between groups, which is another commons. And then you end up with polycentric governance. Yeah, thank you for the links, RJ. This is a really important topic for anyone who wants to explore it further. And I'd love to pass it to Mitty now, because she's been patiently waiting with her hand up. So Mitty, on to you.
Well, it's always great when you can build on what came before, especially when you had a question that preceded what just came before. So I'm really interested in an element of your portfolio design for the Earth Regeneration Fund slide, because it's something I've been contemplating a lot recently, and I'm still in an early stage of gleaning any patterns from it. One of the elements of that slide speaks to diversity, risks, and benefits. And I have a feeling there's a lot of linking in with what you've just been exploring with Brian. But I'd love you to speak to any of your knowledge and experience with diversity, risks, and benefits, Joe.
Yeah, in the original presentation on the Earth Regeneration Fund, which was in April of 2020, I described projects that could be at different stages of maturity, different levels of complexity, different sizes, different focus. And so just starting to say, these are some of the ways to think about diversity. And I wasn't being exhaustive. I was just trying to get people to think concretely, like, here's a project about educating kids. Here's a project about restoring a watershed. Here's a project about agroforestry. Here's a project about local textiles. And so they are a diversity of projects. Here's one that's in this soil type and this microclimate. Here's another one in this other soil type and a different microclimate, but in the same territory. This one's a larger scale cooperation. This one's someone's backyard permaculture project. And the idea was just to show that we could create taxonomies or lists or ways of describing the diversity. And then from that, start to see the different kinds of benefits from the diversity that we map. So for example, we might realize that by having someone who's doing early childhood education, we actually have a good facilitator. And because a teacher is a good facilitator of learning. And we might not realize that another agroforestry project actually needs facilitation until we're looking at the diversity. And so the benefits of the projects are not just the benefits to the projects themselves, they're the benefit to the portfolio of projects. So simply by bringing them together, you start seeing those edge effects that I'd mentioned. The edge effects are, oh, we could bring that benefit over here. We just didn't think of it until we put them beside each other. And so what I think is really powerful is, if you simply thought of this in the boring way of a financial investor, which is really, really boring. Look at what we did with Paco, Angela, and Antonio. We can get way more interesting if we go beyond financial investment. So financial investment's boring, but let's just start there. Let's say there's someone that's like, I have $500,000 because I just sold my house in California or whatever. I have money and I want to do the most impactful regenerative work. I don't care about getting money back, but how would you manage the risk of me making a bad decision with that money? So you see, it's a financial investment, but a multi-capital return framework. Like, I'm old and I'm going to die soon and I got this money and I want to do the best thing for future generations as it can. How would we even manage the risk of making a bad decision? Well, to have a portfolio of benefits helps us see the portfolio of risks in a more holistic way. Like if you'd put the money here instead of there, your risk is you would lose these developmental pathways. So you see that the risk portfolio itself, just to say what are the risks, changes as we put together the composition. And that's a learning process for investors, where investor means lots of different things. And so what I'm finding in the Barichara work is the more that we create coherent patterns of diverse dialogue, where there were already fragmented diverse dialogues, but they weren't a diverse dialogue together. Once we start to bring them together, these portfolios, we don't even call them portfolios, but it's just a diversity of opportunity, diversity of potentials. And then the risk is the risk of lost opportunity, the risk of the damage done in, et cetera, et cetera. And all that learning is like, that's the magic. That's the sweet stuff. And like, I'll give an example. Yesterday, I met with a woman named Aruth, who's from Spain. She's been in Barichara for a few months. Turns out she works with children and abuse and domestic violence. And she came to me because she had met a young woman that's from a really traditional rural family that is, I would say, has raised her in a way that you could say is developmental abuse. And they're trying to find a way to help her see that she's not just a baby making machine for her boyfriend. As she's getting kicked out of her house because she's a so-called adult at 18. And I was asked, is there a way we could provide financial support for this young woman to get education, to find other opportunities for a livelihood than just being a baby maker? And I said, well, actually, we can create social supports by creating a dialogue with the people doing syntropic agroforestry, the people creating the network of commercialization for food systems, in the commercial kitchen and the local food system, the mercado local, that we talked about in the Barichara updates on Thursday. I said, if we have the people that are doing all of that work sit down together and consider the case of this 18-year-old girl, we will come up with a much more powerful portfolio of benefits to offer her than just giving her money to get some training for something she might be able to imagine doing now. And so you see the portfolio approach generates the new possibilities. And that's what's really powerful about this, is that we don't try to know ahead of time what they are. We try to continually discover and reevaluate what we think they are as we learn. And we diversify by having more collaborative dialogue as we go. And that's where that pro-social process of regulating our emotions, not being closed-minded and judgmental, being open to the psychological flexibility to explore different possibilities. Like I just said, this teenage girl was developmentally abused. What if her parents are the key allies in making this happen? If I'm judgmental and closed, I wouldn't even see the possibility. And so that's just one example where the risk might be my closed-mindedness as the person with money who can help this girl. Right? So the idea is to maintain the adaptive regenerative flows in our dialogues continually. And the portfolio approach allows us to be that diversity rather than just have a list of it. So I don't know, is this helpful? Or is this going in a direction that's fruitful?
Well, that's really helpful, because one of the things I've been contemplating is the limits to what you can tolerate by way of diversity. And I think what I'm hearing in this example that you're saying is that the limits are ourselves, our capacity to actually tolerate diverse ways of approaching a problem. So we are our own limits. So our way to address the limits to growth issue, limits to development issue, is actually to work on ourselves, to develop our own tolerance for diversity.
Yes, and also, as we were saying with Victoria, to create superorganisms, to create ways of collaborating together that add a kind of abundance. There's an emergence of something in the interactions that's not reducible to the parts. And so we are actually more. So when I met this woman, Ruth, and she said, could you maybe fund this woman to get a little more education? I'm like, probably I could. We have a pledge community. We're raising money. The money's for the ecoversity. This is consistent. But what I'd rather do is form a support team of some key people doing syntropic agroforestry. Margarita, who represents this network of transformation of food systems, and Emilce, who's another woman that works on cultural trauma and education in the rural countryside, and was one of the teachers of this girl. And we all sit down together and say, well, what can we do to help her? And we together would, see, it's no longer a question of how much money do we have to pay for an education program. It's like, is it even worth putting her in that education program? Is there something better to do? Like together we'll have much better ideas if we have good trust and openness between us. And so that's what I propose based on my experience of forming these pro-social groups was, we've got a dynamite pro-social group. I named everyone. There's Natalia, there's Margarita, there's Emilce, there's a Ruth and me. We'll just sit down together and then we'll pull in anyone else after that, because that's a small enough group that like next Tuesday for coffee, we could meet and talk. And then we'll bring the 18-year-old girl into the conversation as soon as we agree about how we want to talk to her. And then co-create with her. And we're going to help her learn by empowering her in that process. And so you see this way of, because I know the network, the trophic flow, I could think about configuring humans as trophic flow. But notice it's not manipulative to do it. Everyone I just named is going to love to help this girl. Every one of them. And so there's no manipulation. It's completely transparent and visible. And it's adaptive and responsive to our ability to relate to each other.
Beautiful. Thank you, Joe. And relating to Claire, I bet she's got something to bring into the conversation as well.
I bet Claire,
Thanks.
I would say I'm a 100% bet on Claire having something to bring into the conversation. Claire, please.
Oh boy. Hang on, I don't know why I have.
No pressure.
Yeah. No, I love this. I'm so excited that this conversation is happening. I guess at a very practical level, you know, as individuals, we are kind of the conduits for that work. And if there's something that's getting in the way of us actually being able to do that work, that's going to impede the work. And almost never have I done work, and I've been doing, you know, community development work for, you know, 30 years. And, but there's very rare times where our personal needs of what is interfering in us being able to do that work, is there a space for actually having that conversation? And if that's not part of the conversation, you end up wearing it. So, you know, I end up working like doubly hard. And just for example, because it's pretty practical, if I'm putting in that many hours, I'm not home making meals for my family, which means that they're beginning to resent me because things are falling apart a bit at home because I'm doing that part of the work. But it's, and when you're not getting compensated in money where you can just pay somebody to do that, you carry this additional load. But if that's, anyway, so that's part of the question. The other is that when the people in your personal life see that that those needs are not being even thought about or addressed, there's a kind of a little bit of a sense that you are kind of living a bit of a lie, actually, because you know, yeah, I mean, just speaking personally, you know, not everybody is on board with the work that I do in my home circle, and they don't see that they just see that they're having what I could be contributing taken away from them, and in a society that we're in, if you're not paid, there's very little valuing, and so there's kind of this, well, why are you doing it if you're not getting paid? And anyway, that's a long question, but I think my main question is around, I just have never seen those processes developed to actually do, so what are the needs that are interfering in your being able to do the work? And there needs to be, I mean, sometimes to actually be able to talk about that, there needs to be some vulnerability too, because, you know, sometimes you have to talk about your circumstance. Anyway, that's enough.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to give you a hug. I wish I could give you a hug because I know what it's like to be in an extractive economy where there's just a lot of real world pressure, like there are real world consequences in an extractive economy. And then to not have coherence either within yourself or within your family. That those are so deeply connected. And I feel like one of the key questions here is this relationship between authenticity and coherence. It's one of them. There are many others, it's just one. Authenticity and coherence. For me to be authentic, I have to be incoherent with what is not authentic. And so one thing that happens is a lot of us are already in compromised situations where our authenticity is either we're not fully authentic or we're not fully coherent, or both. Sort of like, one or the other. Like, and we're sort of stuck there, and that's inherently stressful and draining. And then that's one piece. And there's another piece, which is, what do we do when we're in a context where, like, I may have sovereignty in what I'm doing. Like, I suspect after all the years of your work, you have sovereignty in your work. You're really good at just getting going and doing it. And you may be interacting with people where they may not have the sovereignty to do their part. And then you're trying to be co-creative, and at best, you're being cooperative. At best, you're doing things that help each other, but you're not actually in a flow where you're each empowered to lead your own part. And one thing I've found is that there's a very painful truth, which is that we have to get good at empathizing with those that we can't work with, and then releasing ourselves from working with them in community flows, and then living with the consequences of what that does, of creating perturbations or problems or rumors or conflicts. And I've had enough times in my life where I've moved something forward only because I accepted that I was going to create conflicts and problems with people I cared about to continue moving forward. And that was because I valued coherence and authenticity so much. And this is a place that we get into a really deep sort of like, it's almost like a spiritual danger, where we're in danger of compromising different parts of ourselves intentionally. Like, I'm going to do something that contradicts the sacred. And sometimes we're in places where we have to contradict something sacred for something else sacred. And it may not be easy to tell which is which, or which is more important. And this is why I focus so much on planetary collapse being a prerequisite for really doing regenerative work, is that I found in many situations, the reality of, like, for me, am I going to grow a forest, or am I going to have friends in the community? I spent a year being the weird guy out in the biopark growing a forest while playing with my daughter and being estranged from the social spaces of the town in Barichara. And that ended up causing lots of people's weird traumas being projected onto me because I wasn't there. They could paint, they could scapegoat me with whatever they wanted. I was accused of child abuse by a woman who had been abused by her father. All kinds of weird stuff happened while that was going on. And I had to just accept the sort of collateral of relationships are being hurt, but I know what I'm focused on. And so this is something that I'm opening up to just say authentically, these are the places where the deepest compromises occur and the deepest challenges arise, and where some of the deepest spiritual work is needed because it's so hard to do. But just at a more practical level, how do we facilitate groups? It's been really interesting for me to watch Penny stepping into some of the group dynamics in Barichara. And specifically, I'm thinking of, she sat in on a Trophic agroforestry team meeting, and she didn't speak enough Spanish. She was completely lost, but it's like, we invented in the span of 2 hours, a 6-month multi-pronged territorial transformation strategy, and the next day began implementing it. Like, the team was just in such incredible flow. And it's like, oh my God, pro-social group, times 1,000, when does this happen? And I think it's like how a lot of us feel on Earth Regenerators. We're like, wow, we have such great pro-social groups. The rest of my life isn't like this. And and you start comparing your feeling in different groups.
Joe.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I just want to interject, because this has been going on for so long, what we've been doing here. We depend on burning people out, and we burn them out constantly over the years. Okay. And I'm saying this just by the long experience of that. So what we've tried to do again and again is to say that our caring and friendship of one another is the number one thing, or otherwise we discard people. I know that's hard to do. we have big dreams, and we have big pushes behind those dreams. But that's what I've found, and that's what I honestly have to say, is I try to hold my friends close, and they certainly hold me close, or we don't get it done. And when we talk about pro-social, that's really what we're talking about deeply. So I just had to add that from many years running into that.
I want to say that's absolutely true, and it's also profoundly dangerous. And I want to say why, which is when we appease the traumas of people who aren't real friends, it destroys the group process. And this is something really key, as I found that there are essential processes that have moved forward by not just placating the traumas of someone. And I have a lot of like scars from having lived through it. And it's actually, in a way, I think it's a validation of what you're saying. Because what I found is that, like one way I just got conceptually clear on it is, where are the commons? And if I have a relationship with someone that is a commons, those are sacred and I preserve them. But I found there are times where there is a perception of relationship that doesn't actually have a commons. And it's sort of just a confusion. And I think it's actually very consistent with what you're saying. And it's just also something I found is like to say not being friends with everyone. But I think I know what you mean at the same time. and I want to add that part. And I'd love to hear how you respond to that from your experience, because as I see you're smiling, I'd love to hear what you say about that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's important that we let people go when they have other things going on that they simply can't be where we're at and can't completely partner with us. So that happens a lot, but that's very different than really being a friend who is a friend who supports you no matter what, and may be very different and may only be able to do a piece of it and knows where that stops, but you're clear together on that. And then over the years, you lose many people, but you don't lose them permanently because they're always there doing something worthwhile. And you know that common ground. That just comes through experience and working hard at it, I think, and being very clear what you're doing and why you're there. Because if you aren't clear, it's completely confusing to human beings. Thanks.
Guilty, been there, done that. I know exactly what you're saying. Claire, did you have something you wanted to add? It looked like you were raising your hand there.
Yeah, just to say, I just haven't seen that many sort of processes built into, like, what creates the conditions for that pro-social stuff, where we bring in the things that don't seem to be related to what we're trying to do. So it's like, you know, my mom had a stroke the other day, getting into hospital, all that juggling and what have you. Where is the place? Because, you know, really we're focusing on the work to be done, but really the work to be done is just a sense of what are the other pieces that are impeding our own ability to contribute. And I just feel that is something that needs more emphasis, and I don't see enough emphasis on it. And I think especially women are the ones that that carry that, because, you know, usually we've got a whole bunch of other things that we're juggling, and those often those questions aren't asked. There isn't a place, I guess, for
one thing I'd say that's a really powerful approach that's working here in Barichara is there's an organization called Kurasoma. And I talk about my friend Margarita a lot. She actually works with another woman named Gabriela and a third woman named Claudia. And they create what are called Círculos de Palabras, or basically they're conversation circles. And they're women's support circles for cultural trauma healing. And the creation of those spaces for women to talk is one of the elements of the work in the campesino culture here. And so I think that, you know, when we look at the community development work around the world, and the best examples always show that there's a very clear place for creating community spaces for women to gather and talk. That's always a part of it. There are other things that, you know, changes depending on the context, but it's always a part of it. And so that's one thing. It's like, that's, I'd say, is a proven intervention, like a domain of interventions. Women need to talk to each other. That's really important. Another thing that I found specific to planetary collapse is thinking like a geologist. So when I'm working on a forest project that's 30 years, but I'm working in a time frame of 500 years because I'm thinking this work is going to go on way beyond the end of my lifetime. That those different scales of time allow me to see the different kinds of work. So instead of how many trees can I plant this week and I'm freaking myself, like the burnout part, sometimes the burnout is because we actually don't have the supports we need. And that's very common. Another is that we don't give ourselves the mindfulness practice of temporal perception, where we perceive time in a way that allows us to recuperate our bodies. And there's a lot more we can say about this part, this body health piece. But what I found is like, by giving myself a big enough project, somewhat paradoxically, it allows me to calm down. Because I'm working within something so big and so long that if I take a day off, that's just, the ability to, it's like marathon instead of sprint is sort of one of the common metaphors. But this is even more than a marathon. This is like a marathon of continental plates or something, like go to a bigger scale. And I find that deeply helpful in the way that I do my work. Like I'll give myself an hour and a half every day for stretching and be sure and play with my daughter for 2 hours because I'm working multi-generationally. And that's not getting in the way of the work, that is the work. If I'm not able to do that, I'm not doing the work right. And so there's a way of getting at that clarity that is really subtle. It has a lot of healing of our own patterns. So it's not a linear path, but it's super important. I'm just noticing that we're at the hour and a half mark and I want to honor the time. And what I want to ask is maybe just like, is it like a provocation question, I guess? Is like for you to go away and think, in some moment in your life, when were you a regenerative economy? What did that look and feel like for you? How can you internalize into your own life what we're talking about right now? Or where you are now, where you're not where you need to be and you're trying to get to wherever is next. How are you not a regenerative economy right now? And what do you need to do to get one step closer? Because what I found is that when I worked with John Fullerton and I started teaching people his regenerative economics framework, and I already knew about multi-capitalism, and I already knew about trophic flows, and I already knew about energy budgets, I already knew about pro-social, and this synthesis occurred for me. I was like, click, oh my God, I see this in my life. This isn't theoretical at all. It's just a conceptual way of organizing things I already knew. And so what I want to invite is, how do you bring this back into things you already know in your life? How do you go back and say, well, okay, what is honoring community in place? What does it mean to seek balance? Do I seek balance with family time? Do I seek balance with work? Do I seek balance with how much I just like veg out and watch Netflix to not be stressed? Like, how do I seek balance? And you go through those and you start applying them to your life and you find that they're not theoretical. They're just conceptually clear. They're like, oh, if I don't do these things, I'm not healthy. Systemic health emerges by having them. And that's what's so powerful about this. And it also allows us to do another thing, which is, how can I be of service to someone else? Someone may appear to me as some kind of a problem space, like meaning they have a problem I can help with. And I didn't know I could offer some part of me to them. But now that I'm thinking in this way, I see that I can. And then we have more abundance because there are more edge effects in our interpersonal space. I think this is the real beauty of this way of thinking is I can show up in relationship with clarity about different ways I can help. Instead of like, well, if I don't have money to contribute to your crowdfunding campaign, what can I do? Like, well, there are a lot of things you could do, but you just didn't know to think of them. And so it's a way of making that more imaginable. And so I just want to invite that as like, ask yourself, when have you been a regenerative economy? When did you embody some of these concepts? And how is that similar or different to how you are now? How does that tell you where you need to go? Or what kind of help you can give or receive? And I think that that'll really feed into the way that we have the community calls this week and where we end up in 2 weeks when this learning journey comes to an end with more clarity about how to help each other. And so I just want to end there and say this is a lot to take in. It's a lot to think about, but I really hope it's helpful. And I'm really curious what's going to happen in the next few days as this sinks into you and what's going to bubble up. So thank you all for being here, and onward we go.